The desert sun beat down on the lonesome highway as a gang of armed bandits blocked the road. Their eyes locked on an old trucker, thinking he was just another easy mark, slow, weak, helpless. But as the dust settled, the old man stepped out of his rig, gripping a long-barreled revolver, his gaze steady. They had no idea they had just picked a fight with the wrong trucker. They thought he was just an old man until he proved them dead wrong. What would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more intense stories. The sun hung low over the desert highway, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. The old trucker, known to most as Gus, had been hauling freight for longer than some men had been alive. His rig, a classic Peterbilt with a chrome finish dulled by years of dust and sweat, stood parked at a lonely truck stop on the edge of nowhere. Gus sat in the diner, sipping black coffee, his weathered hands wrapped around the ceramic mug. He'd seen trouble before, but trouble usually had enough sense to walk the other way when they looked into his cold, steel blue eyes. Not tonight. A group of young men, 5 of them, all dressed in dark vests and jeans, strutted into the diner like they owned the place. Their leader, a wiry guy with too much confidence and not enough brains, zeroed in on Gus immediately. "Hey, old man," the leader smirked, pulling up a chair at Gus's booth without asking. "That's your rig out there, ain't it?" Gus didn't bother looking up. He just took another slow sip of his coffee. "What's it to you?" The leader chuckled, glancing back at his buddies. "See, me and my boys, we're in need of a ride. Thought maybe you'd be kind enough to, hand over those keys." Gus finally looked up. His gaze was steady, unreadable. "Son, I've seen plenty of men like you, and they never last long." The other men chuckled, but there was an edge of nervousness in their laughter. Something about the old trucker's calm rattled them. The leader leaned in, lowering his voice. "You don't understand. This ain't a request." His hand casually rested on the grip of a pistol tucked into his belt. Gus sighed, setting his coffee down. "You boys are making a mistake." His voice was even, but there was a warning in its tone that most men would heed. The leader sneered. "No, old-timer, the mistake is yours." Gus just smiled, slow and knowing. Outside, the last rays of daylight disappeared over the horizon, and the neon lights of the truck stopped flickered to life. The night was just beginning, and these boys had no idea what kind of storm they'd just walked into. The air inside the diner grew thick with tension. The leader of the gang, a cocky punk named Vince, wasn't used to being ignored, let alone dismissed. His fingers twitched near his pistol, his patience wearing thin. "I don't think you get it, old man," Vince said, his voice dripping with forced bravado. "We're not asking, we're taking." His crew laughed, but it was nervous, like they were waiting for Gus to break, to beg, to hand over his keys. But Gus didn't move. He just gave them that same unreadable stare, the kind that made men shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You deaf or just dumb?" Vince's voice turned sharp as he reached across the table, snatching Gus's truck keys. He dangled them between 2 fingers, grinning. "Guess I'll just help myself." The laughter from the gang got louder. A couple of them moved toward the diner exit, eager to check out their new ride. The waitress, a young woman barely in her 20s, watched from behind the counter, fear in her eyes. She knew better than to get involved. Gus finally exhaled, stretching his shoulders like a man waking up from a nap. "You boys sure you want to do this?" His voice was steady, calm, but something about it made the gang go silent for half a second. Vince scoffed. "What, you gonna call the cops? Ain't no one coming to help you out here, Grandpa." "No," Gus said simply. "I don't need help." That was when Vince lost what little patience he had. With a sharp motion, he pulled his pistol and aimed it square at Gus's chest. "Then you're about to have a real bad night." The whole diner went quiet. The cook in the back stopped clattering dishes. The waitress took a step back, her breath caught in her throat. Even the gang's own guys looked unsure. Pulling a gun on an old trucker in a backwater diner? This wasn't how it was supposed to go. But Gus just smiled. "Son," he said, leaning back slightly, "you're making your last mistake of the night." Vince's grip on the gun tightened, his jaw clenched. He was ready to pull the trigger, ready to show everyone that he was in charge. And that was when Gus moved. Vince barely had time to blink before Gus moved. The old trucker wasn't just fast though, was precise. In one smooth motion, Gus grabbed Vince's wrist, twisting it with bone-crushing force. The younger man howled in pain as the gun clattered to the floor. Before anyone could react, Gus slammed his other fist into Vince's gut, knocking the wind out of him. The diner erupted in chaos. One of the gang members reached for his own pistol, but Gus was already ahead of him. With a swift kick, he sent the gun skidding across the linoleum floor. Another thug lunged at him, but Gus sidestepped with the ease of a man who had been in more fights than he could count. He caught the attacker by the collar and drove his knee into the man's ribs, sending him sprawling into a table. Vince gasped, clutching his stomach, his cocky smirk now gone. "Who the hell are you?" he wheezed. Gus straightened his vest, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a mild inconvenience. "I was hauling freight before your daddy was born," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of something far deadlier. "And I've dealt with punks like you my whole life." One of the remaining gang members stood frozen, his hands halfway raised. "This old man's crazy," he muttered, taking a step back. Gus picked up Vince's fallen gun and ejected the magazine with an expert flick of his wrist. "Nah," he said, tossing the empty pistol onto the counter. "I'm just the last man you should have messed with." For the first time that night, the gang realized they weren't robbing some helpless trucker. They had cornered the wrong man and now they were trapped with him. The diner fell silent except for the labored breathing of Vince and his crew. The once arrogant gang now looked like a pack of stray dogs realizing they had just picked a fight with a wolf. Vince, still hunched over in pain, wiped the blood from his mouth and glared at Gus. "You think you're tough, old man?" he spat. "You got lucky." Gus chuckled, shaking his head. "Son, luck had nothing to do with it. You ain't the first fool who thought I was an easy target, but I can promise you this, you're gonna wish you never laid eyes on me." He turned his attention to the rest of the gang. "Now, I got a question for y'all," Gus said, his voice calm but commanding. "Who here actually wants to take another swing?" No one moved. Gus took a slow step forward, and the gang collectively took a step back. Even the ones still standing were hesitant to meet his eyes. The diner owner, a grizzled man named Lou, took the opportunity to speak up. "You boys think you run this town? You walk in here, rough people up, shake down folks who actually work for a living?" He scoffed. Pathetic. A few of the regulars, truckers who had been keeping quiet, started murmuring in agreement. Some stood up. Vince and his gang weren't used to this. They were used to people cowering, handing over their wallets, avoiding eye contact. Now, they were being looked at like something stuck to the bottom of a boot. Gus leaned in close to Vince. "You see that?" he said, nodding toward the people standing against him. "That's respect. And you? You don't got a damn ounce of it." Vince's jaw tightened, his bravado crumbling. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. Then, Gus made it worse. "You got two choices, kid," he said. "You can leave, tails between your legs, and never show your face around here again. Or you can stay, and I'll make sure every last one of these folks sees just how much of a coward you really are." Vince swallowed hard. His gang looked at him, waiting for a cue. But he had nothing. No witty comeback, no bravado. Just the sickening realization that he had lost. Finally, he turned to his crew. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The gang shuffled out of the diner, shoulders slumped, their image shattered beyond repair. As they stepped outside, Gus called after them. "Oh, and Vince?" The younger man froze, not turning around. Gus smirked. "Next time you think about picking on an old man, make sure he ain't meaner than you." The door slammed shut behind them, and the entire diner erupted in laughter. As the door swung shut behind Vince and his gang, the tension in the diner slowly faded, replaced by the hum of conversation and the clinking of coffee cups. The regulars chuckled, shaking their heads at the foolishness they had just witnessed. Gus, unfazed, took his seat again and sipped his coffee as if nothing had happened. Lou, the diner owner, wiped his hands on his apron and let out a low whistle. Well, I'd say that's the first time anyone's ever seen Vince leave with his tail between his legs. One of the younger truckers, a kid named Benny, leaned in, still wide-eyed. "Mister, I gotta ask, where'd you learn to fight like that?" Gus set his coffee down and gave the kid a knowing smile. "Son, I didn't learn to fight. I learned how to finish fights." The diner erupted in laughter again, but Gus wasn't just joking. He had lived a long life, seen a lot of men who thought they were invincible, and buried just as many who had learned the hard way. Some lessons only come with time. One of the older truckers, a man named Earl, nodded in agreement. "Ain't about how tough you are, it's about knowing when to stand your ground. That's what these young bucks don't understand." Lou wiped the counter, glancing toward Gus. "So, what's your story, old man? You don't talk much, but when you do, you sure make it count." Gus took a deep breath and looked out the window, watching as the desert sun cast long shadows over the highway. "Ain't much to tell," he finally said. "I've been on the road longer than most of you been alive. Seen all kinds good, bad, and worse. But one thing never changes. Bullies will always underestimate the wrong man, and when they do, they pay for it. The men around him nodded. Every trucker in that room had their own stories of trouble on the road, crooked cops, desperate thieves, punks looking to make a name for themselves. But none of them had let those challenges break them. That was the unwritten code of men like Gus. Benny, still taking it all in, finally spoke up. So what happens when they come back? Guys like that don't usually stay gone. Gus smirked and tipped his hat back. Then I guess we teach him the lesson again. Some folks take longer to learn. The diner went quiet for a beat, then erupted into laughter once more. The fear that had lingered in the room when Vince and his gang first barged in was now completely gone. Respect had taken its place. As Gus finished his coffee and prepared to leave, Lou leaned in. "You ever need a free meal? You got one here. No charge." Gus nodded. "Appreciate that, Lou. But I don't stick around one place for too long." He got up, adjusted his hat, and walked toward the door, leaving behind a room full of men who had just witnessed something they'd never forget. As Gus stepped outside and into the cool evening air, he glanced toward his old rig parked near the pumps. He wasn't sure how many more miles he had left in him, but he knew one thing: no matter where he went, the road would always test a man's character. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, he'd always be ready to prove that some men, no matter their age, weren't to be messed with. Now, let me ask you, have you ever seen someone stand up when nobody else would? Have you ever had to prove that you weren't as easy a target as someone thought? Share your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories from the road.